thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you and to discuss these ideas with you today. As my paper is still a little bit rough at the edges, I will read it out. I hope it will not get too boring, and I prepared some slides. The topic I will talk about is called Two Concepts of Concepts and Perceptual Content. And just to say a few words about the theoretical background of what I will be talking about, it is an attempt to explicate some ideas that we find in the philosophy of Edmund Husserl and in the philosophy of Ruth Millikan as well, in order to make a distinction between, as the title already suggests, between two types of concepts and two types of perceptual content that, at least so I will try to argue, we should distinguish in order to better understand the way in which we deal with the world we are ordinarily confronted with, as well as we deal with social robots and stuff like that. So I'll just start with my talk. Here's the structure of what I will be talking about. First, I will say a few words about the distinction between predicative and pre-predicative experience according to Edmund Husserl. In the second part of the talk, I will talk about what I would like to call tacit concepts and pre-predicative content. In the third part, I will try to explicate the content of pre-predicative content as pre-predicative content as general content in sensu diviso, and distinguish it from predictive content as general content in sensu composito. And then I will give a little outlook on possible applications in robo-philosophy and stuff like that. There is a certain tendency within contemporary philosophy to identify the conceptual capacities that structure human thought with the conceptual capacities that structure the phenomenal contents of perception. Just a short side note, when I talk about the contents of perception in the following, I have, following phenomenological orthodoxy, in mind something that is phenomenally given to a subject in their experience. So I'm not talking about the world that lies there outside, but the way the world is given to subjects as intentionally structured and stuff like that. So to perceive something as an object of a certain kind P is then assimilated to some kind of judgment that involves the concept of P, so that the latter, the concept of P, enables both the capacity to phenomenally perceive P's and the capacity to judge that an object given in perception is a P. The aim of my presentation is to show that the capacity to perceive something as an object of a certain kind P, for example, as a living thing or an animate object or something like that, and the capacity to either explicitly or implicitly make a perceptual judgment of the form, this thing is P, rely on two separate forms of conceptual capacities, which constitute two distinct kinds of perceptual content. On the one hand, so the basic outline of the idea, we have tacit concepts, in German I call them Begriffe von, that underlie the subpersonal constitution of what Husserl calls pre-predicative or non-conceptual contents of perception, while explicit concepts, which I call Begriffe für in German, structure the predicative or propositional content that might accompany the givenness of some pre-predicative content. A perceiver can thus have the tacit concept of P so that she is able to perceive P's pre-predicatively, that is to say that she is able to perceive things as P's pre-predicatively, while not having the explicit concept of P, so that she might not be able to realize or judge that an object she perceives is phenomenally given to her as a P. I will further argue that the something as something structure, etwas als etwas Struktur, with which we usually articulate perceptual content, for example, when we use sentences of the form, she perceives the moving object as a living thing, has to be understood in two radically different ways concerning these two cases. So if on the one hand, a subject is able to perceive objects as P tacitly, we can ascribe to her the possession of a certain tacit concept of P. If, on the other hand, a subject is able to perceive objects as P's explicitly, we can ascribe to her the possession of the explicit concept of P. However, in the tacit case, the perceiving subject does not have to be aware of the fact that she tacitly perceives the object in question as a token of a general type P, while in the explicit case, she's necessarily aware of the fact that she perceives the object as falling under the object category of P's. Now come to the second part of my talk, tacit concepts and pre-predicative content. And for the talk itself, I will focus on the notion of pre-predicative content and tacit concepts, as it is like the more uncommon concept that I try to establish. In order to explicate the conception of tacit concepts, I want to start with an example. From our very early infancy, the distinction between animate and inanimate objects is quite important for navigating the environments we find ourselves confronted with. As a number of experiments show, this is just an arbitrary quote here, quote, 8 till 10 months old infants show violation of expectancy effects when a self-propelled fur-covered entity is revealed to be hollow. That is, they apparently expected there to be something inside it. As such findings suggests, infants perceive self-propelled fur-covered entities as animate objects or living beings manifested, among other things, in the perceptual expectation that they are not hollow. Now, in general, we tend to describe the phenomenal content of such forms of perception as exhibiting the something as something structure. Namely, we would say that the child perceives the self-propelled fur-covered entity as an animate object. It is now reasonable to assume that animate objects are not the only category of objects that infants can perceive and identify tacitly in this way. They will, for example, tacitly perceive a certain person as their mother, certain entities as liquids, and so on. Now, what underlies such a form of perception in infants is arguably some kind of conceptual capacity. Children aged 8 to 10 months already seem to have a kind of concept of animate entities that enables them to tacitly grasp or perceive entities that have certain features as animate. As the empirical findings suggest, perceiving something tacitly as animate now manifests itself, among other things, in certain perceptual expectations, the presence of which can be inferred from respective startling responses that arise when the expectations in question are disappointed. I now start from the assumption that we would not, however, attribute to children aged 8 to 10 months the possession of the general or explicit concept of a living being, with the help of which they would be able to judge, either implicitly or explicitly, that the self-propelled fur-covered object they see is a living being, and with the help of which they would be able to build corresponding thoughts. Thus, on the one hand, it seems reasonable to attribute conceptual capacities in such cases, as might also be suggested concerning the complexity of the behavior of certain animals. However, on the other hand, it seems misguided to attribute such capacities in the full-blown sense of general concepts, which might imply what Gareth Evans calls the generality constraint with regard to the description of thoughts and conceptual content. In the following, I will focus on the seemingly much more simple perceptual ability that we already find in children and animals, because it seems to be often neglected with regard to the way we conceptualize our experienced world. The proposal of my talk is now that we can explicate this kind of tacit perceptual ability and the corresponding perceptual content with the help of Edmund Husserl's conception of pre-predicative experience, vorprädikative Erfahrung, as he develops it in his posthumously published work, Experience and Judgment. Husserl's basic idea is that we must distinguish between predicative experience, which is mediated by concepts in the full-blown sense, and whose content can be articulated in the form of predicative judgments, and pre-predicative experience, which is mediated by what Husserl calls types. As Husserl develops the thought, pre-predicative experience denotes a, quote, low-level kind of perceptual synthesis that prefigures, as it were, synthetic forms like S is P. While types are conceived as a kind of proto-concepts or stereotypes that implicitly structure the way that situations or objects are given to us in experience. Contrary to what one could expect from phenomenology, in a somewhat Selasian way, one could say that Husserl holds the conviction that there is no given in perception that is not mediated by conceptual capacities, although he distinguishes between two different types of conceptual capacities mediating our experience. As all phenomenologists, Husserl relies on the observation that every perception is to be described as a case of perception as perceiving something as. That is to say that what we are given in perception are never disordered collections of qualia, but mereological unities perceived as instantiations of certain types of objects that are the products, as Husserl describes it, of subpersonal processes of passive constitution and synthesis. Husserl's thesis now is that although both predicative and pre-predicative experience are cases of perception as, the way in which something is given to us as something is fundamentally different in the two cases. Now, how exactly is this difference to be understood? When Husserl claims that even pre-predicative perception can be described as a case of perceiving as, he has something very specific in mind that can be explained by the way in which, according to him, types are operative in pre-predicative perception. Here's the first introductory note. Just have to put away the screen like that. A quote from Husserl himself. The factual world of experience is experienced as a typified world. Things are experienced as trees, bushes, animals, snakes, birds, and so on. But what is apprehended, like perceived according to type, also has a horizon of possible experience with corresponding prescriptions of familiarity. Vorzeichnungen der Vertrautheit is the German phrasing, I think. Possible experience with corresponding prescriptions of familiarity, and has therefore types of attributes not yet experienced but expected. When we see a dog, we immediately anticipate its additional modes of behavior, its typical way of eating, playing, running, jumping, and so on. We do not actually see its teeth, but although we have never yet seen this dog, we know in advance how its teeth will look. End of quote. Now, Husserl's idea is that the type is implicitly operative, the dog type in this case, is implicitly operative in pre-predicative experience by pre-structuring the horizons of possible experience and familiarity, which constitutively belong to the object as it is phenomenally given to us in perception. To quote Dieter Lohmer, a Husserl scholar von Husserl, I just read my English translation of the quote, but you have the German quote as well there. The type functions as a vague, empty sense frame Bedeutungsrahmen, sense frame or meaning frame of the expected object, which can be filled with sensuous appearances, sinnliche Anschauungen, in various ways. But it can also contain qualitatively precisely fixed determinations. With the help of the type, we apperceive. Apperception is like the phenomenological term for perceiving something as. We apperceive the unknown in the mode of the known, the unfamiliar in the mode of the already familiar. End of quote. The main function of types operative in tacit perception is thus first to enable a pre-reflective identification of what is perceived. For example, an identification of what is perceived as mother or animate object. And second, to mark out and co-present, like appresent, the phenomenologists often use this notion of appresentation. Something is added to what is like originally given in perception. Then it is appresented. Mark out, the second, to mark out and co-present specific horizons of expectation that constitutively belong to the phenomenal object as it is given in perception. So for example, tacitly perceiving an animate object implies that certain horizons of expectation are co-presented and thus constitutively belonging to the phenomenal object itself. Like Wittgenstein's famous discussion of seeing aspects with regard to the example of the rabbit duck, we can thus imagine two perceptual situations in which a perceiver can have completely identical visual impressions, but perceive them once as belonging to an animate entity and once as belonging to an inanimate object. The difference between the two cases lies, if we follow this Husserlian line of thought, in the respective co-presented horizons of associations and expectations, whose co-presentation is guided in each case by the respective type implicitly operative in perception. Perception is thus never to be understood only from this phenomenological perspective as a representation of something that is already out there in the world, but always also as a pre-presentation of things that lie in the immediate or imminent future of the perceiver. And these horizons of expectation, as I already indicated, constitutively belong to the phenomenal object as it is given in perception. Now, it will be important for the following to keep in mind that as Husserl conceptualizes the function of types in pre-predicative perception, perceivers are not directly aware of the types that underlie and structure their pre-predicative perception. The only thing which perceivers actually are aware of is that which is phenomenally given to them in their experience, namely, on the one hand, the part of the object which is impressionally presented to them in perception, like the qualia, stuff like that, the front side of the thing, or stuff like that. And on the other hand, the concrete horizons of expectation that are phenomenally co-presented, or as the phenomenologists say, appresented in perception. So to simplify things a bit, one could say that the pre-predicative perception of something as an animate entity does not consist in an awareness of the form, this is a living thing, but rather in a set of concrete expectations related to the particular perceived thing, which take the form of this thing there could suddenly start moving on its own, or this thing there could change its direction in an arbitrary way, or this thing there would react in a certain way if it is hit by a stick or something like that. Types then, to use John Searle's term, are part of a subject's individual background. If we understand background as the ensemble of dispositions and schemata that mediates a perceiver's direct perception and perceived possibilities for action under given circumstances. According to Husserl, types themselves grow out of sedimented experiences and remain open to change through further experience, which give them a certain plasticity in the life of every single subject. For example, through the use of ringtones, such as those used in doorbell ringing, alarm clock ringing, or call ringing, we have internalized corresponding types that, depending on individual habitualization, allow us to hear the corresponding sounds directly with a certain meaning and with corresponding horizons of expectation, so that we can feel called, for example, when another person's alarm clock happens to use the same ringtone that we use as a calling sign, or as a call tone. Another example would be that due to the existence of cars in our life world, since childhood, we have acquired, through habitualization, types, a car type, that are specifically calibrated to the behaviors of cars, and that include, for example, the expectation of unusually fast and massive objects to be expected from the left or the right, something like that. Or if, for example, we will get used to elaborate social robots, we might internalize specific types that will shape our direct experience and expectations according to the behavioral capacities of the robots in question through a process of reciprocal calibration, or something like that. So just to give some more theoretical and systematic background, I will say a few things about Ruth Millikan's concept of substance concepts, which is, I think, quite similar to the ideas that Husserl proposes. An analogous conception of a conceptual capacity that underlies the formation of perceptual contents of a low level can be found in Ruth Millikan's conception of what she calls, following Aristotle, substance concepts. As I try to argue at length in my dissertation, Millikan's conception of substance concepts is equivalent to Husserl's conception of types, at least with respect to essential aspects, even if, other than Husserl, Millikan situates her approach within a broadly naturalistic paradigm. Like Husserl, she argues that substance concepts serve two major functions in perception. On the one hand, they enable the cognizer to tacitly identify objects as objects of a certain kind or as a certain substance. On the other hand, they provide the cognizer with a, quote, grasp of how to project some of the invariants defining the substance to new encounters through what Millikan calls substance templates. I brought two quotes from Millikan. The conception one has of a substance is not merely the ways one knows to identify it, but also the dispositions one has to project certain kinds of invariances rather than others from one's experiences with it. One pole of the substance concept consists of more or less reliable means by which to recognize the substance. The other pole is a rough grasp of an applicable substance template or templates. And another quote, knowing what to expect of a connected physical object and knowing to expect something different of a pile of sand shows that the child is capable of distinguishing between the domains of application of corresponding substance templates, end of quote. In this context, Millikan also points out the difference between what she calls identifying and classifying, which is closely related to the distinction between pre-predicative and predicative experience or perception. In the case of classifying, predicative judgments of the form X is F or X is an F are made about a given object with the help of predicate terms. In the case of identifying, however, we are dealing with the direct perception of an object as an object of a certain kind, in a certain mode of givenness, so to say. Here's another quote from Millikan. You can't classify without some grasp of what you are classifying. You have to be able independently to think of the object you want to classify before you can classify it. Identifying an object, on the other hand, does not always require something conceptually prior. But whatever it is that one classifies, it is clear that the capacity to think of members within the domain to be classified is more fundamental than the ability to classify. Identifying is a skill prior to classifying. As far as terminology is concerned, as I already indicated at the beginning, in the following, I will speak of tacit concepts instead of types or substance concepts. But in a systematic perspective, I think these conceptions are quite similar. One could argue if there are certain differences, but I think this is not important for the point I try to make. If the previous considerations are sound, pre-predicatively perceiving something as a P comes down to the co-presentation or appresentation of a P-specific horizon of expectation concerning some, as phenomenologists call it, hyletical core. They mean something like the qualia, which are impressionally given in perception. So I'll just read the sentence once again. If the previous considerations are sound, pre-predicatively perceiving something as a P comes down to the co-presentation or appresentation of a P-specific horizon of expectations concerning some hyletical core of presentation. So something is given to me, like visually presented in my perception, and then co-presented as the horizon of expectation as fundamentally belonging to the thing which I perceive. That's the idea. Whenever a subject pre-predicatively perceives something as a P, what is directly presented in perception will be appresented or augmented with this P-specific horizon of anticipation. At the same time, however, the perceiving subject has not to be aware of this commonality between their various P perceptions, as the tacit concept of P operates in the background of its perception. As Husserl describes this situation, an object can be pre-predicatively, quote, stand before us with a certain, with a character of being known, while, quote, the general type to which it owes this character remaining unthematic as such. In German, ein Gegenstand kann mit einem Charakter der Bekanntheit vor uns stehen, wobei das typisch Allgemeine, dem diesen Charakter verdankt, als solches unthematisch bleibt. In the next section, I will argue that based on the previous considerations, the distinction between pre-predicative and predicative content of perception can be fleshed out with Abelard's distinction between the generality of beliefs in sensu diviso and the generality of beliefs in sensu composito. This distinction was taken up, among others, by David Lewis and José Luis Bermúdez. And I now come to the third part of my talk, just to flesh out the distinction between the two different types of content, pre-predicative content and predicative content, and the specific types of generality that goes along with them. An even clearer picture of the distinction between pre-predicative and predicative experience emerges by resorting to a distinction of two forms of the generality of belief states, which was proposed by Abelard and taken up by David Lewis, Jonathan Bennett, and José Luis Bermúdez, among others. It is the distinction between general beliefs in sensu diviso and general beliefs in sensu composito. In his book Conventions, David Lewis illustrates this distinction with the example of the expectation that all drivers will drive on the right side of the road. If a person holds this expectation in sensu composito, she has, quote, one expectation with general content. Thus, she expects that every driver will keep right. So this is like a phrasing of the content of her expectation. Every driver will keep right. It does not follow from this, however, that in a concrete case, she expects that Jones, a driver that she's confronted with, will keep right unless she succeeds in classifying Jones as a driver. On the other hand, if a subject has the expectation then that all drivers will keep right in sensu diviso, she has, quote, many expectations, each with non-general content. Thus, instead of expecting every driver to keep right, she expects each particular driver she encounters to do so. Ah, this one will keep on the right side of the road. This one will keep on the right side of the road. So she just has a number of individual beliefs with respect to particular objects or persons in this case. Thus, instead of expecting every driver to keep right, she expects each particular driver she encounters to do so, even if she completely lacks, quote, the general concept of a driver. Thus, possessing a general belief in sensu diviso is equivalent to possessing a, quote, certain disposition to form singular beliefs with regard to certain types of objects. A belief in sensu diviso thus allows, to take up Millikan's distinction, correct perceptual identification with regard to a tacit concept F, while it does not imply the capacity for corresponding as explicit conceptual classification. A quote from Bermúdez once again: whenever I encounter an F, or indeed whenever I think about one, I tend to come to the view it is a G. End of quote. Accordingly, Bermúdez describes the difference between the two attitudes as a difference in the scope of application of universal quantifiers. Quote, Bermúdez: universal quantifiers will feature in the attribution of both types of general belief. But in the case of general beliefs in sensu diviso, the universal quantifier will fall outside the scope of the belief operator. While in the case of general beliefs in sensu composito, it will fall within the scope of the belief operator. End of quote. Simply put, in the case of beliefs in sensu diviso, the subject itself is not aware of the generality of its belief, insofar as it only ever forms concrete beliefs with respect to particular individuals, or concrete expectations with regard to concrete particulars and individuals. In the case of belief in sensu composito, in contrast, the subject is aware of the generality of its belief. Thus, one either has the belief in sensu composito that all Fs are G, or one has the belief in sensu diviso with respect to each F one encounters that this one is G. Thus, for a general belief in sensu diviso, the situational formation of a corresponding individual belief, which refers to the currently present object, is sufficient, without the subject itself having to be aware that it possesses a general belief regarding Fs in sensu diviso. There is a striking similarity between the distinction between propositional beliefs in sensu diviso and propositional beliefs in sensu composito on the one hand, and the distinction between pre-predicative and predicative perception as on the other hand. Thus, in the case of pre-predicative perception of something as something mediated by tacit concepts, we encounter precisely the form of implicit generality that is found articulated in Lewis and Bermudez as the generality of propositional states in sensu diviso. However, although these cases are strikingly similar, a certain dissimilarity between them lies in the fact that it does not seem to be plausible to ascribe single beliefs of the form, I see this there as G, in the sphere of pre-predicative experience. This is, I think, where a Husserlian account of pre-predicative experience comes back into play. To pre-predicatively perceive something as something does not have to be explicated with reference to single beliefs we ascribe to the perceiving subject. Rather, whenever subject pre-predicatively perceives a thing as a thing of a certain kind F, their experience of the particular object phenomenally comprises or phenomenologically appears to be augmented by an F-specific horizon of expectations. However, as we already saw, this does not imply that a subject that possesses the tacit concept of a certain kind of object F has to be aware of the generality of its respective pre-predicative perception of Fs. Insofar as this perception manifests itself only in concrete horizons of expectation with regard to every particular object thus perceived. Further, the possession of a tacit concept does not imply that a subject possesses a corresponding explicit concept, even in the case of a subject that already speaks a language. This means that we cannot rely on the conceptual frameworks with which we are used to describe our manifest world of experience in order to account for the various and fine-grained ways in which we pre-predicatively experience the world and the events and objects within it. If we take the distinction between pre-predicative and predicative experience seriously, we have thus to strictly distinguish between what I would like to call the tacit ontology of a subject's pre-predicative perception, which stems a perception which correlates with its tacit concepts, and the manifest ontology and the manifest folk ontology, in German I call it Alltagsontologie, which stems from the explicit conceptual frameworks that they learned as part of a certain linguistic community. This distinction between two different ways in which a perceiving subject can be said to experience the world in a categorically structured manner is, at least to my knowledge, often overlooked even in phenomenology itself. If the previous considerations are sound, however, we must distinguish between the way the world is pre-predicatively and passively given as a categorically structured, as categorically structured, depending on the tacit concepts the subject possesses on the one hand, and the way the subject is disposed to predicatively judge the world to be structured based on the explicit concepts it internalized during language acquisition on the other hand. We can thus distinguish between what might be called the tacit Umwelt, to use Uexküll's notion, or Wirklichkeit with regard to a subject's pre-predicative perception, from the folk ontology, what I in German call Alltagsontologie, which concerns the life world that it takes to live in together with others. In many cases, or so I would argue, we will find numerous divergences between the tacit Umwelt and the folk ontology of one and the same subject. In this respect, it seems to me that phenomenology in particular can take on an important philosophical function by critically reflecting on the ontological presuppositions associated with our learned folk ontologies or what Sellers calls the manifest image of the world and the conceptual frameworks that articulate it, against the yardstick of our tacit Umwelten or Wirklichkeiten. Such a distinction now also allows for cases where a subject will pre-predicatively perceive something as an object of a certain kind P, while it is at the same time inclined to predicate that the object in question is not a P. If, for example, we were confronted with a sophisticated social or emotional robot, it might well be the case that we pre-predicatively perceive it as an animate object, while we might still be inclined to predicate that it is inanimate. And now come to the last part of my presentation, which is basically just an outlook. As I said at the beginning of my talk, there is a certain tendency within contemporary philosophy to identify the conceptual capacities that underlie the way we phenomenally perceive the world with the conceptual capacities with which we usually describe our experience of the world as well as the experienced world itself. If the Husserlian and the Millicanian account that I previously tried to put forward is sound, we should, however, be careful not to conflate these two dimensions of experience, both mediated by different kinds of conceptual capacities. Further, there might be a certain temptation to think that pre-predicative experience is, in a sense, overwritten in humans with the acquisition of language, and that they, as soon as they learn explicit concepts, begin to experience their world mediated by these explicit conceptual frameworks. However, I would like to suggest that pre-predicative experience is not replaced by predicative experience once we have acquired the explicit linguistic concepts with which we can think about and describe what we are perceiving. To quote Richard Rorty on this issue, quote, "The snare to avoid here is the notion that there is some inner illumination which takes place only when the child's mind is lighted up by language, concepts, descriptions, and propositions, and does not take place when the child inarticulately wails and writhers. The child feels the same thing, and it feels just the same, to him before and after language acquisition." End of quote. As I would like to argue, we'd rather have to distinguish between two different layers of content when it comes to our ordinary experience, which are at least somewhat independent from each other, at least in certain respects. While the pre-predicative layer of experience is structured by tacit concepts, which operate, so to say, in the back of the subject, they stem from the background of the subject, by marking out the concrete horizons of expectation co-presented in pre-predicative perception of particulars, the predicative layer of experience relies on the explicit concepts a subject has learned and acquired as part of its language acquisition. As Wilfried Sellers has argued, such explicit linguistic frameworks always belong to a certain community of language users and thus come with specific norms for their correct application. They consist of rehearsed ways you and I think should be used to describe the common world of our everyday lives appropriately. Unlike our tacit concepts, the shaping of our explicit conceptual frameworks with which we describe the world of our everyday life lies, at least in a certain sense, in our own hands and is thus open to what is nowadays often called conceptual engineering. Thus, when the world of our experience changes, say, due to the proliferation of social robots in ways that make our familiar explicit conceptual frameworks rather obstructive, it can be an important philosophical task to work wisely and carefully to productively reshape those very explicit conceptual frameworks. And if I understand it correctly, the OASIS framework that you develop aims, among other things, at just such a transformation of our manifest vocabulary in order to let us better cope with the changes we are confronted with nowadays. I will now end my presentation with two concluding remarks. The first remark concerns the question of whether and in how far the previous considerations could be of interest for robo-philosophical issues. As should have already become clear from the foregoing, the distinction between predicative and pre-predicative experience seems particularly relevant at those points where changes occur at the level of subjects' everyday experience that have not yet been reflected in our explicit conceptual frameworks, or in what Miranda Fricker calls the hermeneutic resources of a community. The realm of intelligent, emotional, and social machines now seems to be a particular area where such changes are currently taking place. And I think it might be of great use here to accompany these changes also with the help of the distinction between tacit and explicit concepts that underlie our experience. On the one hand, one can currently already observe to what extent the implicit applications of already internalized tacit concepts can lead to difficulties with respect to dealing with social robots, for example. However, it will also be important for us to observe which new tacit concepts people acquire when dealing with different types of artificial intelligence, and to make them more tangible and manageable by forming corresponding explicit conceptual descriptions and concepts. My second and last remark concerns a specific perspective on phenomenology as a philosophical method in general. If it is true that we can distinguish between the pre-predicative and the predicative structure of our experience in the way described, then this may have consequences for our conception of what phenomenology as such can contribute to the general aim of philosophy. I would like to conclude by quoting Sellars once again, Sellars' specification of the aim of philosophy, which he provides at the beginning of his seminal paper, Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man. And you will all know this quote, I think. I just read it once again because it's nice. Okay, quote, "The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. To achieve success in philosophy would be, to use a contemporary turn of phrase, to know one's way around with respect to all these things, not in that unreflective way in which the centipede of the story knew its way around before it faced the question, how do I walk? But in that reflective way, which means that no intellectual holes are barred." End of quote. Although I assume, or it can be argued that Sellars had in mind here primarily the determination of the relation of things in the sense of the manifest image of the world and things in the sense of the scientific image of the world, the preceding considerations nevertheless also permit a location of the project of descriptive phenomenology within this broader project of philosophy. What descriptive phenomenology can provide in this regard is a specific kind of second-order orientation with respect to the tacit concepts that structure our pre-predicative experience and that are not to be directly identified with the explicit conceptual frameworks through which we describe our common manifest image of the world. Phenomenology can do this insofar as phenomenological concepts and descriptions do not, as I would like to argue, aim at explicating our explicit conceptual frameworks. They don't articulate what Sellars calls the manifest image of, it depends on how you interpret what Sellars means by manifest image of the world. But this would be the point that I would try to make, yeah. So phenomenology can do this insofar as phenomenological concepts and descriptions do not, as I would like to argue, aim at explicating our explicit conceptual frameworks, the frameworks of our manifest image of the world. It rather aims at explicating the categorical givens of our pre-predicative experience that are mediated by tacit concepts. By inventing concepts and descriptions that enable situated subjects to grasp the pre-predicative givens, which until then they had only implicitly distinguished from one another, phenomenology can thus contribute in a very concrete way to understand a subject's tacitly knowing its way around in pre-predicative experience. However, the explicit discrimination of pre-predicative givens and the corresponding tacit concepts, for which language has not yet provided us with explicit concepts, is not operationalizable in a simple way. And this is exactly the reason why, at least I think, phenomenology considers itself to be a philosophical method that has to be learned and applied in the first place, because it's not that simple to get a grasp for the pre-predicative categorical givens And this task could also be, as I already pointed at in the beginning, could also be realized by at least some types of empirical psychological research. I think if we focus on the disappointment of tacit expectations and stuff like that. However, I think that especially in view of the technical developments and challenges we are currently confronted with, this explication is an important philosophical task. Yeah, thanks for your attention. I hope I wasn't too long. Yeah. I think as I presented this Husserlian idea, I somehow suggested that Husserl, and sometimes it sounds a little bit like that Husserl derives his conception of types from like conceptual experience proper, or from predicative experience proper. This indeed at some point seems to be the case. At the same time, when he describes the way that the types structure our experience, he talks more in this fashion. So we have a certain type which gets stabilized through experience, which pre-draws these horizons of expectation and familiarity, and it is always open to change through new experiences. So, in a certain sense, I would try to argue that what Husserl has in mind is specifically this kind of idea on the right side. And his idea, or his project in experience and judgment, Erfahrung und Urteil, is precisely to give something like a genealogical explanation of how like predicative judgments are to be grounded, or are able to be grounded in pre-predicative experience. So for him, the idea is it's quite important that pre-predicative experience is, in a certain sense, the primary way in which we experience the world. And then later on, we institute this kind of predicative structure on top of this kind of experience. But if I understand him correctly, pre-predicative experience does not disappear with the acquisition of explicit content. So we always have this kind of dynamic structure where these new types can be like changed in experiences, or even like this situationally adapted, and so that we have the kind of type which is just like valid within a certain limited situation, and then disappears, and we never have to use it again, or something like that. I don't know if this answers the question, but yeah. The other thing which is important for Husserl is, and this is the difference between the two concepts, the two aspects, between the predicative and the non-predicative, pre-predicative experience, is that in the case of pre-predicative experience, the type itself constitutes the phenomenological object. So we cannot presuppose that there is already an X, which is then like through the type getting identified as an F, but what we directly experience is an F. So you find like interesting descriptions of these kinds of cases in Ruth Millikan's unclear and confused ideas as well, which I find quite fascinating and interesting, especially in relation to these phenomenological ideas. Yeah, but then you're right. There seems to be in paralyzing, because if you remember, I try to somehow to escape these problems during my talk, but when you describe pre-predicative experience in the Husserlian sense, you always have to say that there is something of the object which is directly given to me in perception, and then we have this appresented horizon of expectation, which constitutively belongs to the object that I experience. And I try to suggest that the X that we predicate with explicit concepts is like the same thing, the thing we perceive from the object, which is like identified through a type. But this is not quite correct, because in the whenever we work within the conceptual framework of explicit concepts and stuff like that, we already have something like a manifest ontology where you already have like the objects and stuff like all this. It's like a ready-made world, you know. But in the case of pre-predicative experience, the objects themselves and what they are gets constituted by the types which mediate the experience. So that we have to, if we talk about a number of individuals experiencing one and the same situation, it might well be the case that the tacit ontologies with which they are confronted diverge in significant manners, that they don't experience the same situations and the same objects because the types which mediate their pre-predicative experience are not the same. Although they might still, if they talk with each other, refer to one and the same explicit manifest image of the world, just to like their different ways of experiencing the world. And this is, I think, this is also the important point that that Sellers makes when he says that as soon as we use explicit concepts, we are participating in a manifest image which we take to be a normative and also a normative descriptive image, which we all share together. And that's why we criticize each other if we make like false claims within the manifest image or with regard to the normative rules that structure the way we apply the explicit concepts which structure this image. Sorry for taking so long with my answer. Yeah. Yeah, that's really an interesting question with regard to Heidegger. The distinction that I thought about when developing this ideas, which can be found in Time and Being and Time, Being and Time. Yeah, I think in the first paragraphs is Heidegger's distinction between the hermeneutical as and the apophthetical as, das apophantische als und das hermeneutische als. And as he describes it, if we are ordinarily coping with the world, yeah, we have this hermeneutical as structure, which is somehow similar to pre-predicative experience in the Husserlian sense, right? And I'm not. I would be interested in like, or let's say it another way. My ambition would be because in a lot of instances we find this idea like phrased out, and I think you did it in a quite similar way, that there is some kind of pre-reflective coping which somehow doesn't really involve consciousness or something like that. It sounds quite automatic sometimes, and yeah, that Dreyfus in a way, and then it gets interrupted in something like a consciousness like lights up or something like that. And I would like, and I think Heidegger has the like all there is needed. He talks about die Sorge. I think he says Sorge, care has its own sight. Die Sorge hat ihre eigene Sicht, and this sight, he calls this sight die Umsicht. die Umsicht, yeah, circumspection. And circumspection like discloses like horizons of opportunities. And there's some, yeah. And I would think, yeah, right. This is the difference between two different modes. But as I would like to explicate it, and this is quite ambitious, and I haven't developed and fully developed these thoughts, would be that this is like too dichotomic a distinction to make. And the idea would be that even if we use language, so if we talk with each other, we like tacitly apply pre-predicative tacit concepts of the explicit concepts which we internalize through language acquisition. So I would try to ground this kind of conceptual way of dealing with the world within the pre-predicative like dimension. But I haven't fleshed this out. This is just speculation. I'm not sure if this even works or something like that. But this would be the idea. And then the event of having horizons of expectation interrupted would always be the same in all cases. So we always have whatever we do, or normally, at least if we are not totally depressed or something, we are always like working within horizons of anticipation and meaningfulness in a certain way, so that this kind of disruption is not that clear cut. But there seems to be a difference of we find a similar problem in Husserl, but I'm not sure if I can explicate this systematically, like ad hoc. But in Husserl, we sometimes find the idea, he talks about the general thesis of the natural attitude. And his idea seems to be that what he calls the Generalthesis der natürlichen Einstellung is like a tacit positing of the things that we experience as existing in themselves. And his idea is then that we have to, when we do phenomenology, we have to bracket this kind of folk ontological way of seeing the world in order to make room for pre-predicative experience, the way that the phenomena are really given to us in experience. And I think my idea would be that even Husserl at this point is like I think he uses philosophical prejudices and projects them into the way that human beings normally perceive the world. I don't think that there is something like what Husserl calls the general thesis of the natural attitude, which has this kind of ontological other framing and totally different kind of experience that goes with it, but that we are always, even if we are not aware of it, living within this pre-predicative domains, so to say, although we often tend to neglect these dimensions when we use the explicit ontologies which we use to explicate our ordinary life world. So that, for example, people tend to, like, especially philosophers, sometimes they tend to say things like atmospheres don't exist because I can't put them into my ontology of everyday life. Atmospheres somehow seem to escape the usual ways of, and I think this is a kind of strange like deformation professionnelle, which somehow because in normal conversations and stuff like that, they would have no problem of talking about atmospheres and stuff like that because they experience them. They are part of their pre-predicative experience of the world and stuff like that. They just have learned certain vocabularies that they take to like permit like posing the existence of such things or stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah. The question is, what do you mean by making them explicit? As I understand the method of phenomenology, it is a method of Heidegger. We just talked about it. Heidegger calls this at one point the formale Anzeige, the method of formale Anzeige. And as I understand it, and we find similar ideas already in Husserl, and the idea seems to be that our pre-predicative experience is already categorical. So we have different like categories of given phenomena that are distinguished by whatever, these types or something like that. And his idea is then that phenomenological language is to be understood in a completely different way than we usually use our explicit concept of Alltagsontologie, folk ontology, to talk about the world we live in. And how do they have to be understood? The idea seems to be that a phenomenological concept always deictically refers to a pre-predicatively given. And the task of phenomenology is to evoke and describe situations in which subjects can find their way, like the deictic way, through through language to realize the phenomenon that was intended to be like addressed through the concept. And in this sense, the question would be: is there something which can escape this kind of deictic showing, which is, as I take it to be, the method of phenomenology? There could be, but it would be something beyond the categorically givens of pre-predicative experience. Yeah, I hope this helps. So we don't have, because usually we have this idea of, and a lot of phenomenologists also apply this idea quite naively. We have our experience, and then what does phenomenology do? It does eidetic variations and stuff like that, but it also does like descriptions of experiences, as if language could somehow like incorporate the contents of experience. And I think this is a wrong understanding of what phenomenology does. Phenomenology is like this deictic endeavor of trying to explicate. And if you read a lot of Heidegger stuff like that, if he talks about boredom, Langeweile, and stuff like that, it's quite it's like reading a novel or something like that, because it really evokes situations in which we can like imagine ourselves and then know, this is the kind of feeling that he's trying to address. And how does he address it? He evokes a certain situation, explains how the situation is, and then says, this specific feeling. Do you know this feeling? Is this? Do you already know this feeling? Yeah, something like. I think you're totally right there, and there is a. It's for me, it was more like a strategic decision to talk about these things as tacit concepts. Yeah, because a lot of philosophers can like do much more than if we would have said like this is non-conceptual or whatever. The people think that like, oh, it escapes conceptuality or whatever, or it isn't. We aren't able to grasp it because it's like blah blah, something like that. And I wanted to escape this kind of route in talking about the non-conceptual or something like that. Yeah, no, but you're totally right. There is this danger of like again, and we find this often in phenomenology. Or phenomenologists accuse themselves or gegenseitig reciprocally accuse themselves of reifying the terminology. And if we read Heidegger on Husserl, he says something like, Husserl was much too much reifying experience, blah blah blah, and I'm doing the real thing. And if we look into the newer French phenomenology, they say the same thing about Heidegger. It's always like, you're the reifier, you don't understand the basic idea of phenomenology because it's about the phenomena themselves. Yeah. Yeah, you're totally right. As soon as you suggest that the thing totally on the left, the conceptual scheme of explicit concepts and the ontology that goes with it, which is normally taken to be like a fixed ontology of classes and things that belong to classes and stuff like that, and you are somehow, if you understand the pre-predicative working of types with as somehow being derivative towards this kind of ontology, so that the question is just how do we get the types to fit the true ontology or something like that, which we already take which we already take for granted. We get into this problem. And it would be that's why I talk about when I talk about this the manifest world. I don't talk about the manifest world, or as phenomenologists do about the Lebenswelt, but I use this somehow, which sounds a little pejorative, this notion of Alltagsontologie. Because it's like the conceptual schemes that we use to somehow bring order into appearances in a way that is useful for intersubjective coordination and stuff like that. But the idea is that this folk ontology, as Sellas already suggests, is itself a thing which is in flow, which gets elaborated through the centuries and stuff like that, and which does not have to be identified with the scientific image of the world. So we have this kind of folk ontology, which we use as human beings to coordinate our behaviors and stuff like that, which is somehow implying a world of a folk world or a manifest world. But this is not the like true ontology of the world or something like that. And from this, I then try to distinguish these, I call them in German is Gegebenheitsontologien, which refer to the tacit ontologies, the tacit Umwelten of subjects, and then they can diverge. And then the idea is, if we understand how these tacit Umwelten or Wirklichkeiten are structured, and how out of them evolves something like a manifest image of the world with the conceptual schemes, Alltagsontologie and stuff like that, and how then out of this emerges a scientific image of the world, we can escape this danger of reification. But I didn't want to talk about this all because it's like too much, and it sounds like presupposing much too much. Yeah. No, I would totally agree at this point. But yeah, I myself try to show that that such a Husserlian notion of types is like more, if we want to frame it like that, it's not representationalist at all. It's like more pre-presentationalist, if it, yeah. So that if we try to explicate the tacit ontologies of a subject, or the tacit ontology of a subject, we can somehow, if we take just one moment in time, we could somehow think about, okay, there is this huge ensemble of tacit concepts structuring the tacit Umwelt or Wirklichkeit of this subject. But this changes all the time. And if we talk about the ontology of appearances, the Wirklichkeitsgegebenheitsontology of the subject, it would be, I try to suggest that in my dissertation, but I don't like at length argue for that, that we would have to use like process ontological or event ontological terms in order to explicate like the tacit ontology, which structures perception. And we have to get away from this kind of religious focus idea. Yeah. One problem that I sometimes have when I talk to an activist or stuff like that they are too, sometimes it sounds like they are too anti-scientific, like there is no, I'm not sure. I find this quite appealing. And you also find these similar ideas in Husserl as well. He talks about das und so weiter der Erfahrung. So what these types basically enable the subject to do is like to know how to go on. Or if you listen to a song, you anticipate like what are the possible next notes. And if the song strikes a sour note, you like get irritated because this is not within the scope of what you expected as. Yeah. How could it possibly go on or something like that? Yeah. This is a complicated question, I think. And usually phenomenologists seem to be optimistic with regard to the question whether we are able to somehow realize the pre-predicatively categorical givens. Somehow they, at least if you read them in a certain way, and certain phenomenologists in a certain way, they seem to have this idea that we can like have some kind of grasp of these categories. And for example, if Heidegger introduces a notion like Sorge or Zuhandenheit, he thinks that, or at least this is how I would read him, that Zuhandenheit names a general structure which is usually, as he says, unscheinbar, ein unscheinbares Phänomen. How do you translate that into English? Yeah, non-thematic, something like that. Not really in the thematic focus or attention or something like that. But that through the phenomenological method, which is why I think it's sometimes compared to Achtsamkeitsübungen nowadays. And we could like take seriously that Husserl talks about Cartesian meditations. There is a kind of like getting used to focusing your attention in a different way to the way the things they are usually and already always given to you in experience, and that we can somehow accomplish such a shift of attention. Making people realize, yeah. Yeah, this is the old like Schiller. Yeah. Right. This is like Schiller. Wenn aber die Seele spricht ach schon die Seele nicht mehr. Yeah, like as soon as it gets, but then again the idea would be that, okay, this might be right, while we reflect on our experience and write it down, try to find phenomenological descriptions that enable other people to realize these phenomena. But maybe if we already like I'm not sure, but if we already got used to phenomenological literature and stuff like that, and you can, a lot of like real literature and novels and stuff like that already do that. Like they make you realize what you always already experienced, but never like thematically had in focus. There is this, I use this this quote from Harald Schmidt, which says to Christian Kracht, I use it in my dissertation, there it says, ich glaube, Sie können vieles formulieren, was ich nur dumpf empfinde. I think that you can articulate a lot of the things that I just numbly like, yeah, feel or something like that. And the idea would be that maybe, but I'm not sure about that. And another question would be if the way that a subject itself would be able to like explicate the structure of its pre-predicative givens through phenomenology, if this would really correlate with the findings that we find if we do empirical psychology and search for startling responses and disappointments of expectations and stuff like that, if these would correlate or if they wouldn't. And I think like Thomas Metzinger like attacks phenomenology exactly because of that. He says something like, okay, we don't need phenomenology, and then it does something similar, where he says like we don't need phenomenologists, we just do like hard empirical research, psychology and stuff like that, and we will see that the fine-grainedness of experience can be explicated in a much more rigorous way than phenomenologists could have ever imagined. Yeah. I think in some pages in my dissertation, I try to develop a concept of empathy with respect to the idea of internalizing and like calibrating types with regard to persons with whom we interact or something like that. Yeah. And so if you have like a close relationship with someone, the idea would be that you somehow internalize a tacit type of the person, which then structures the way that the person immediately appears to you. And this is like already always effective and stuff like that. And it can be like, you can have like abrupt aspect changes in this kind of experience as well. For example, if you find out that whatever, the person that whom you trusted or something like that has done something terrible or something like that, you have like an aspect shift which lets you see the person in a totally different way because it's, yeah, and stuff like that. Yeah, I try to at least in rudimentary form to flesh out something along these lines.